Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk a little bit about ethics and morality. In particular, I want to explain why secular morality, or morality without God, typically fails. And before I get into that, I just want to clarify a few things about what I am saying and more importantly what I am not saying. So I'm not saying that atheists cannot be moral or saying that atheists cannot have a moral system that they believe is justified and that they follow. This is just descriptively false. There's countless atheists. There's countless atheistic moral systems out there. I'm not saying those don't exist. There's countless atheists who behave morally as well. Additionally, I'm not saying that a moral system must exist. I'm not proving objective morality exists in this video, nor am I trying to use the existence of some objective morality to prove the existence of God. I think objective morality exists, but my belief in an objective moral system is ultimately substantiated by my faith in Christ, which I've argued for in other videos and is way beyond the scope of this particular video. Specifically, what I am trying to argue for in this video is a philosophical claim that moral systems developed without God at the foundation or without God will ultimately fail as a moral system. In other words, any secular moral project is doomed to fail. So to start, I want to give you a definition or just a working definition of morality, just so we all know what I mean when I'm talk about morality. So basically, morality is an answer to one of the most basic and foundational questions that a person can ask, and that is, how ought I live? Morality is what gives us behaviors, actions, virtues, decisions, and/or values that will produce a life that is good or is considered well-lived. So, morality basically allows us to define certain actions as good and other actions as bad. Crucially, when I'm discussing morality, I'm talking about a normative framework, which means what people ought to do. I'm not giving a descriptive framework of morality, which would be what people believe we ought to do, describing what people believe about morality. That's not what I'm talking about in this video. So we're talking about a normative system, and to be able to define an ought, we need morality to provide us with a standard upon which we can base the goodness or badness of certain actions. If, based on our moral standard that we define, an action is good, we ought to do it. Otherwise, if an action is bad, we ought not do it. So the task of defining and justifying a moral system is ultimately a task of determining a standard upon which to measure the goodness of human behavior and prescribe oughts to human action. So how can we determine a standard for morality? To understand how we can come up with a standard for morality, let's back up and consider where our standards for other normative systems come from, or for other normative claims. For example, let's consider a fan. Fans, as I'm sure all of you are aware, have blades that spin and blow air. But some fans are better than others. For example, if a fan's blades spin but don't blow any air, we would consider it a bad fan. It ought to blow air. In a sense, there is a normative claim being made here about what the fan ought to do. But if its blades spin faster and it cools more efficiently, it's considered a good fan. It behaves how it ought to. So where does this standard ultimately come from? How can we make an ought claim about how a fan behaves? Ultimately, the standard comes from understanding the purpose of the fan. The purpose of the fan is to blow air to cool down a room. So, its normative standard is how well it performs that purpose. That's where we get the normative standard from, upon which we can say what a fan ought to do, whether the fan is good or bad, whether it's a good or bad fan. In And this logic extends to other types of normative claims as well. In epistemology, we say a belief is good if it corresponds to truth, or if it is true, and bad if it is false. We ought to, based on epistemology, we ought to believe true things. The standard here is truth, because the entire purpose of the field of epistemology is to aim at true beliefs. In language, we ought to communicate in a manner that others will understand, because the purpose of language is effective communication with others. So we have this purpose, we get a standard from that, and we can make normative claims about certain fields. So let's move back to morality. What does it mean for a human being to act good? How ought a human behave? Well, similar to other normative systems, when we're trying to define a standard here, we can look back at the purpose of a human being. But this gets a little bit confusing, because what is our purpose? With a fan, we can see that we made this fan to cool down the room. It has a very clear, defined purpose. We designed the field of epistemology to help us discover true beliefs. We created language to communicate. The purposes are there. We defined them when we made them. But with humans, how can we possibly determine our purpose? What is the purpose of a human? What is the purpose of humanity? It's not as clearly defined and as clearly obvious as before. How do we even begin to answer that question? I mean, there's questions of if there even is an answer to this question. And we aren't born just inherently knowing why we're here. We're not born knowing what we're supposed to do. Sure, maybe we could use science and look back and see where we came from, but that only tells us how we got here, not why we're here. We still don't grasp our purpose from that. So the problem is that from our own frame of reference, we can never get an answer to this why on our own. We'll always have some disconnect from knowledge of our purpose. We would need someone to be there at the creation of humanity to relay its purpose to us and to relay to us our purpose for being. Like if the fan didn't have a person there to tell, if the fan was sentient, that didn't have a person there to tell them what its purpose was, why it was created, how would it know? It would have to ask another fan who might know a person who created it. I don't know. But basically the point is we would need someone there from the start when humanity was created, if you believe humanity was created, or at the inception of humanity, to relay to us our purpose for being. And as a Christian, I ultimately believe we have this with the Bible. This is God's divinely revealed word to us, telling us what our purpose is, what moral framework we should follow, all of that sort of stuff. Our Creator relayed to us through the prophets and the apostles, and also the incarnation of himself in Jesus, our purpose, the reason why we were created. And in accordance with our purpose, certain moral guidelines are set forth throughout the Bible to ensure that our action is ordered towards our purpose. And thus, we ought to follow these moral guidelines as they align our action with our purpose. The standard is our purpose, which is found in Scripture, and that gives us the actions that determine what a good human does, what a human living into our purpose for being created, for being here, ought to do. As a result, any action that's not aligned with this morality set forth in the Bible, if the Bible is true, is out of line with our purpose. And we ought not engage in such actions. But to have this knowledge of our purpose, we would need access to the mind of our Creator. We would need a God. We would need God as the basis here. And this is actually very similar to how we determine the purpose of other things that we apply normative judgments to. In the case of the fan, we know the fan's purpose because we created the fan with that purpose in mind, and thus judge it as good or bad based on that purpose. In the case of language, we designed language for the purpose of communication. So as a result, we can judge expressions of language as good or bad based on that purpose. But what makes defining morality for ourselves so difficult, in our case, we did not create ourselves. So we don't inherently know our purpose. Our purpose isn't readily available for us in that way. In other words, we need the creator to reveal it to us, the person who created us with a purpose. So let's jump into some examples of secular morality. And we can already kind of see why this might be so difficult, trying to do this disconnected from the creator, disconnected from our purpose. So in the case of secular or godless morality, you're going to have a very difficult time developing a standard of morality without an understanding of purpose. Typically, the standards that people end up coming up with will be vague or arbitrary or incapable of producing a good life. So when it comes to developing a secular morality, there's a few directions that you can go. And these aren't all the directions. I'm not going to cover every secular moral system here, but I want to give a few examples. So the first one, just the most obvious connection that we have with good and bad is good and bad sensations. It's our pleasure-pain mechanism. That pleasure-pain mechanism within humans gives us a direct connection with good and bad experience. But taking this as a standard on its own typically leads to suboptimal results, which explains why very few people seriously defend hedonism as a moral system. For example, a man in a heroin-induced euphoria cannot be said to be living the good life in any sense, yet his pleasure receptors are at peak experience of joy from a hedonistic perspective. And even if we start extending this over the long run, a life of pleasure denial may ultimately be more good and fulfilling than a life of pleasure maximization, which doesn't make sense in the hedonistic worldview. There's no reason why we should be seen as our purpose to be maximizing pleasure. So there's no reason why that should be the standard. So hedonism is not justifiable or optimal for living by as a moral system. So what if we took a more biological approach, a sort of survivalist perspective that views us as basically that maybe we maybe what we ought to do is just survive and place life as the standard, as this could be seen as the inherent goal of all life. All life wants to continue living. That's kind of the whole principle of evolution. Like, we want to continue living to be able to reproduce and continue our genes throughout the next generations. However, the problem is taking life as a standard on its own doesn't really lead to a good life necessarily either, this sort of survivalist perspective. Is it really better to live longer in every circumstance? What if that means foregoing joy in life? For example, eating sugar or drinking alcohol in moderation or taking road trips. Cars are super dangerous. Is a longer life worth it if it requires misery and boredom? So it seems like the two most natural systems that you can come up with of maximizing pleasure and maximizing life don't necessarily work on their own without more clarification. So let's consider some other attempts to resolve some issues with these particular systems that kind of use these as essentially standards, but kind of expand on them to address some of the shortcomings. So one common standard that you might hear put forward by like secular humanists is that of human flourishing, of general human flourishing. And this standard seems a lot better, as it seems to account for some of the issues with life. For example, a miserable life isn't worth living because it's not a flourishing life. And pleasure as standards on their own, because in a sense, pleasure on its own isn't exactly the same as flourishing. Like, flourishing could be seen as living this pleasure-denying life that ultimately brings fulfillment at the end of the day. You could argue that is human flourishing. However, the problem with this standard is it's so vague. It's kind of a catch-all for whatever we kind of all think is good, whatever we think is flourishing. It's so vague that it's essentially meaningless. A murderer could view murdering everybody as maximizing their human flourishing, because for them, what flourishing means is the ability to go around and kill people. And you could take that in all different directions with all sorts of different other vices that, or more than vices, like murder's way worse than just a vice. But you could take that to all sorts of different directions. But the basic problem is the standard is so vague that it's essentially meaningless. What exactly does it mean for a human to flourish? Without an understanding of the purpose of humans, we don't know what it actually means for someone to flourish. You're essentially just left with this tautology that human behavior, that good human behavior is that which is good for humans. It's literally tautological. Like, you're not defining what good is in that sense. You're just replacing it with the word flourishing. Good human behavior is that which is good for humans. You haven't gone anywhere unless you have some understanding of what the purpose of humans is, of what flourishing actually consists of how fulfilling, or how flourishing is achieved through fulfillment of a purpose, because the flourishing implies some sort of purpose behind the human. So you can argue for human flourishing as a standard all you want, but until you know what humans are for, you cannot actually say what human flourishing is. In the absence of God, we don't know what human flourishing is. We don't know what humans are for. And as a result, we can't know what human flourishing actually is. It becomes this completely arbitrary standard that we can ultimately fill with preference. We can ultimately fill with whatever preference individual groups of people have. And if those preferences change or are completely different from culture to culture, we can't actually say what preferences are actually human flourishing. We don't actually have a consistent standard upon which to base a moral system. So that's what I have to say for human flourishing. Another approach that I want to address here, that I was very familiar with earlier on in my philosophical journey, is that of objectivism. I feel like I need to mention objectivism in this video just because, given my old audience, the first thing that people are going to say when they see the title of this video is, "You don't believe in godless morality? Ayn Rand came up with morality without God." And I probably made those same arguments in the past. So you kind of got a hint of this before when I was talking about sort of the survivalist ethic. That ethic's a little bit different from objectivist ethics, because though objectivism posits life as the standard, it's different from the standard of life that I just critiqued. Objectivism tries to avoid these issues that I presented by defining life qua man, or life as a man, or life as a human, as the standard. But the problem with this, once again, you're going to kind of see tiebacks to my previous critique here. That's entirely arbitrary. Rand basically is arguing that man should live a life according to his nature as man. But without a knowledge of our nature and a purpose that can only come from our Creator, we don't know what life qua man is. The phrase is so vague, you can sneak almost anything into that phrase. You can sneak in almost any action, any behavior. For some people, maybe life qua man involves theft, involves murder, involves all these horrific actions that are difficult to defend. You could say that this is not life qua man, but that requires you to have some meaning of what qua man is. Where do you get this concept of living according to man's nature? Rand would argue that rationality is man's nature, and that he should live according to rationality. But on one hand, how does she know that? And then on the other hand, how can we generalize or come up with a system about what actions are rational survival? There's so many disagreements on what those are. So many people have completely different perspectives and have ultimately what they view as their own rational reasons for making certain decisions. And we don't see the future. We don't see the future of what actually is going to produce a rational life continuing on, and like what's going to ultimately produce the most flourishing. So ultimately, we're left with these competing arguments. There's like a whole standard of like reason as just this gold standard where that's always true. That everybody has their own reasons that they're applying to different things. Obviously, there is truth. I believe in truth, but that's that we're getting on a tangent. But so to tie it back to the point, is rationality always beneficial for all humans? Is murder always irrational and anti-life qua man? You can argue for these points all you want. You can say that rationality is always beneficial for the survival of all humans just by the nature of what humans are. You can say that murder is always irrational just based on the nature of what humans are and how we handle murders. And you could go in all these different directions and argue all these points. But to answer them is going to ultimately require some foundational knowledge of man's nature and man's purpose that we simply cannot access without God. Bringing all of this together, any standard beyond the failing hedonist or survivalist moralities ultimately relies on some view of what it means to be a good human. But to know what a good human is, we need to know our purpose. We need to know our why. However, without knowledge of the intention of our creation, we will always be disconnected from that why. We can only ever get knowledge of this intention, of this why, from a God. Therefore, I believe that secular projects to construct a system of morality are ultimately doomed to fail. They do not know us, so how can they tell us what to do? And with all of that, I'm going to open it up to the comment section. I'm hoping this prompts some good discussion because there's so much more that can be talked about on this particular topic. You could even see me in that section on objectivism, starting to go off script a little bit, and I was like wanting to go in all these different directions. I had to pull myself back in because there's so much to discuss on each of these topics. There's so much more to dive into on all of these systems of morality. And there's other attempts at secular systems too that some people do believe. So there's so many different directions that we can go on this that I just didn't have the time to fully flesh out, just for the sake of brevity, but also for the sake of focus. Sometimes branching out too much can make a video very unfocused and make the topic not punch as hard. But I hope that was clear. I hope that was coherent. And I hope all of you guys enjoyed. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments and leave your own ideas down there. And then along with that, I want to thank you all for watching. Like the video if you liked it. If you want to see more content, if you liked it that much, go subscribe. My videos will go right into your feed. And then if you really enjoyed the content and just want to give me money for whatever reason, there's also a Patreon down below where you can donate. I also have a Discord where we can discuss things and try to build a little community. But with all that said, I want to thank you all for watching. And I hope to see you all in the next video. Peace.